Hi, all. Thanks again for joining us this evening. My name is Dave from the consultant team, many of which you'll meet here tonight. We're here for the Lower Christmas Tree Hill Undergrounding and Evacuation Improvements Workshop. This is our second workshop. We have a lot of great information to share with you all and hope to gather some great feedback. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So in terms of an agenda here, again, I'll introduce the team here shortly. We'll go over the meeting purpose, what we hope to present, and again, leave plenty of time for Q&A with you all. I'm going to do a quick participant poll just to get a sense of who is joining us here this evening. And then we're going to go through a recap of previous engagement, mainly that first workshop. Then talk about regulations and guidelines for design and introduce some conceptual design improvements. So that will be a presentation. We'll have a pause amidst that presentation to give you all a chance to ask any questions before we get to the end, but then we'll leave plenty of time as well at the end of the presentation to provide some Q&A. So on the next slide, you'll see that we have many members of this team. It takes a village, and this is who's here present today. We have RJ and Nick from the town, Becky from BKF, who you'll meet here shortly, Ryan and Bree from Parametrics, who you'll also meet here shortly, and then Quentin and Dasha from my team at Plan to Place. And then we also have present Chief Lando, as well as Greg Wright from PG&E, who will be here to help with the Q&A portion as well as needed. So on the next slide, just wanted to give you a quick overview of the intent of the meeting here tonight. Really, as I mentioned in the agenda, it's to share a summary of feedback we received and then really dive into the regulations and standards for guiding the design and conceptual improvements for safe emergency evacuation. That'll all be part of the presentation. Huge part of it is a listen from you all, and then ultimately is to help kind of develop the preferred design alternative to really improve the transportation system in the area and really kind of understand the evacuation, egress, and parking management, all of which will be part of the presentation here tonight. And then real quick on the next slide, just want to let you know we do have chat available throughout the presentation. If you did have any comments or questions, feel free to go ahead and put that into chat. We'll try our best to respond to items in chat that we can, but we hope to hold some of those pertinent questions until we get to the Q&A, at which point we'll give you all a chance to verbalize any comments or questions you have. And I'll ask you to use the raise hand feature, which is at the bottom of your toolbar, which I'm sure you're all experts at now. And if you're calling in, you could also dial *9. And once that hand pops up, it'll let me know to go ahead and unmute you, and then a member of the team will be able to respond to the question that you have. So with that, we are going to do a very quick poll because it would be great to know again who's here with us tonight. And we do this at the beginning of every meeting, really to get an understanding of how you found out a meeting, maybe why you're here, and then real quick demographics just to make sure that we're kind of reaching all members of the area that want to be a part of this process. So what I'm going to ask you to do is if you bring up your phone and your phone's camera to the QR code and go ahead, that'll get you a link directly to the poll, or you can go to menti.com and dial in 2976-0430. All of that information is also going to be available on this next screen that we are about to bring up, and then we're going to go ahead and launch into the poll. So I'm going to go ahead and take over control here and share my screen. Okay, could you all see that okay? Yeah, great. So what's going to happen now is it looks like a few of you have already gotten on there. We're going to go ahead and flip through this poll fairly quickly so we can go ahead and get started with the meeting. So again, if you haven't had a chance, you can go ahead and bring your phone up to the QR code and or go to menti.com and plug in this code, which will be on the screen the whole time we go through this. So here we go. First question is, we like to ask a very quick icebreaker question, and this one is, what do you love about Corte Madera? We all love something about Corte Madera. This is your chance to go ahead and weigh in. And you can go ahead and type that in, and hopefully here shortly a few answers will start popping up on the screen. And we'll kind of get going here. Doesn't look like anyone wants to answer this question, which is okay as well. Oh, there we go. Small town feel, excellent. Okay, great. We're just going to go ahead. Oh, there we go. Another small town. Excellent. Great. This shows that you all are tracking along beautifully. Excellent. Fabulous park. Beautiful, lovely people. I love it. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and launch into the actual poll now. So we're curious, again, kind of what methods are most effective. We sent out mailers. There was stuff posted through social media. There were A-frame signs, word of mouth from neighbors. We're just curious how you found out about this meeting, and you could hit all that might apply. Okay, good. So it sounds like everything worked, which is good to see. A-frame signs and physical mailers maybe were the most effective. I'm just going to keep moving us along. You all will have a chance to kind of go back and answer any of these questions. Next is just how long have you lived in the Christmas Tree Hill neighborhood? Just trying to get a sense of those joining us here this evening, who just how long you've generally lived in this area would be beneficial for us to get a sense of. Okay, as you all could see on the screen, looks like a 11 to 20 so far is taking the reins. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next. We wanted to know your level of concern about evacuation plans in this neighborhood. We were guessing most are probably very concerned, and maybe that's why you are here. We'll go ahead and keep on moving forward. We are going to be talking about parking here this evening, and we are curious how many private off-street parking spaces that you might have access to, whether it's 0 all the way up to 4. This would be good information for us to have. Okay. All right. All right. As you all could see on the screen, it's kind of across the board. One of everything other than to have up to 4 spots. Okay, great. Thank you for sharing that information. That's really helpful. And I believe with that, that is the last question we had. So thank you again for taking that. It's really helpful for us to know. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing screen and hand it back over to Becky, or to bring up the presentation, and then RJ to get us started. Over to you, RJ.
Hi there, RJ Suko, Director of Public Works. So I was just gonna, for those that haven't been following all the way through over the last, 6 years, was gonna give a little recap of kind of how we got to this point and what efforts have come before us. So you can go next slide, Becky. So really, the bulk of the engagement started in 2019 through 2021. The town started an effort that was to prepare a climate adaptation assessment. This involved, probably upwards of a dozen public engagement events, some focused around kind of shoreline vulnerabilities, some focused around hillside and wildfire vulnerabilities. And really that was kind of our first real big set of discussions with everyone about, what is it that, the town should focus on that we're not already doing. There's a lot of feedback from the hillside neighborhoods. There was obviously concerns about wildfire and mitigation, and also evacuation, and also a request for electrical undergrounding, which is basically the process in which you take electrical lines that are provided by PG&E and you put them underground. So following that effort, we did a Rule 20, which is the program that basically establishes how to go about undergrounding with PG&E undergrounding district. And that's the image that you see in the bottom right. As you can see, it's not extremely large. It's really the funnel point of Edison and Redwood, right as it approaches, Redwood Magnolia Quarter Avenue. And really the basis for that was to just ensure that, since that is really the ingress egress point for 95+% of the vehicle trips, what would happen if a power line went down? What would happen if there was some other thing that blocked that point? And we wanted to make sure that there was some level of redundancy. So that's why that was prioritized. We'd love to do more of the hill, but these are very expensive. That component alone, that limit alone is roughly $1.1 million. So then later after that, town, continued on and eventually proceeded with this current effort, which is something that lives in the climate adaptation assessment. Is a project that identified multimodal and evacuation improvements. And so we started this back in fall and have been working on it. This is our second workshop. Next slide, please. And we're trying to figure out, how best to improve the evacuation and overall, roadways for all users that use them. We want to also address the underlying infrastructure such as sewer and storm drains while we're here as well. And we are at a point where we've developed some alternatives based on the first round of comments and are excited to show them to you and get your feedback on kind of how we're doing so far. So that's why we're here today, and excited to move on with the rest of the show and answer any questions and take your feedback. Thank you.
Great. So a big part of the project background is the prior community engagement that the team conducted back in the fall of 2024, as RJ noted. During that initial virtual workshop, the project team, we were joined by representatives from PG&E as well as Central Marin Fire, who presented on work that they have done on the hillside, and sort of helped us to set the stage for where we are now, which is starting to look at some conceptual improvements for the area. So back at our November 2024 outreach, Central Marin Fire presented on their wildfire hazard mitigation program. This program had various elements that include information on creating defensible space. They also touched on some of their own vegetation management initiatives that they've been undertaking as a way of just sort of fire protecting the area as a whole. Also, during that initial workshop, we looked at the town's climate adaptation assessment. So this is a report that the town had commissioned that talks about a variety of different climate and weather related scenarios that could impact the town and how the town needs to address those through initiatives or through additional projects so that the town is resilient to those climate change elements. So part of that climate adaptation assessment that really pertains to the hillsides are some priority actions related to electrical undergrounding or system hardening, as RJ mentioned, reducing the risk of potential ignition due to down power lines, also reducing the potential impacts that a down power line or down power pole might have on evacuating the hillside. And then the climate adaptation assessment priority actions also touched on the need to look at transportation network capacity enhancements, generally in the form of widening, so that we can get more people out quicker while we have concurrent ingress of emergency service vehicles during some sort of climate disaster. Following our presentation, where we introduced some of these improvement strategies from the climate adaptation assessment, we opened the mic to the public because we wanted feedback from you on some of these strategies so that we can get some additional ideas about where we wanted to take this project. So we received a lot of feedback from that first workshop. I have a couple of key items highlighted here. There was a really notable interest in undergrounding of the overhead power lines or utility lines in general. There were some expressed concerns with bottlenecks on the roadway, particularly near Crescent Avenue and up further on Redwood. So folks both voiced some concerns about some particularly tight spots during an evacuation. There was a call to maintain as much on-street parking as possible. We understand the parking is well utilized, so we heard that loud and clear. We also heard some interest in exploring some alternative exits from the hillside. As you probably all know, and as we'll discuss in more detail here, there's really one way in and one way out for most people who live on Christmas Tree Hill, and that is through Redwood Avenue out to Corte Madera Avenue. So we did hear some interest in seeing if there's other ways that people can get out in case of an evacuation event. And then, of course, we did hear calls, and we're always mindful of, the desire to minimize construction impacts, try to couple up as much work as possible so that, we can condense construction schedules and not have, perpetual construction work in the neighborhood. All right, so next we're going to talk about how we establish goals and regulations that we use to guide us as we put together our conceptual designs. Again, these are conceptual designs that are in response to the climate adaptation assessment and some of those priority actions and improvement strategies that assessment spelled out, as well as based on feedback that we received from the community during that first workshop. All right, so first, let's just get an understanding of the existing condition so everybody knows where exactly we are looking at improvements at. So this is a map of the lower Christmas Tree Hill area, lower being everything confined by Edison, Morningside, and Redwood Avenue. So we're not going up Marina Vista, we're not going up Summit. This is essentially the lower area that we're talking about. Everything with the green dash, these are all the internal streets in the lower area that we have been analyzing. So if you've driven up Lower Christmas Tree Hills, I'm sure most of you have, you're very aware of the character of the area, narrow, tight streets, very curving. We see a lot of power poles and retaining walls constraining the roadway. And there is an abundance of on-street parking that further constrains the travel width, making already narrow roadways effectively even more narrow to traffic. And then, of course, as we noted, we have that single point of access for most of the neighborhood down at the base of the hill on Redwood. So to understand our design criteria, we consulted a number of regulatory documents, and this includes the California Fire Code. We felt that going to the fire code made the most sense for this neighborhood because this is a residential neighborhood. It's quasi-rural. It's a very low volume roadways. So we looked to the California Fire Code because it provides the least onerous, the most flexible standards in terms of roadway width requirements, right? We're not trying to turn any part of Christmas Tree Hill into an arterial. We want to just provide some modest safety improvements so that we can get folks out quickly and effectively during an evacuation event. So in looking at the California Fire Code, this document establishes that fire apparatus roads, essentially any road that you want to get a fire truck up, you should have an unobstructed width of 20 feet. So this 20 feet, this allows for two-way vehicle traffic, very tight two-way vehicle traffic, but traffic essentially allowing, let's say, an emergency vehicle coming up the hill and a resident passing down the hill. So 20 feet, again, quite narrow, but this is our minimum that we're looking for. We met with Central Marin Fire District after establishing this 20-foot criteria and worked with them to understand if there's additional criteria or other considerations that we have that they should have as we look to identify how wide to improve these roadways. And it was during our discussions with Central Marin Fire that we identified that there's a handful of roadways or segments of roads in the lower Christmas Tree Hill area where we can apply a narrower required width. And so these are roadways where we don't have a lot of traffic from other areas, like it's whoever lives on the road is the only traffic on the road. There are also areas where there's not a lot of homes and where we would not expect emergency personnel necessarily to be circulating through that area. So in those areas, that being Crescent Road, Portola Way, and Morningside Drive, we've established a looser criteria of a minimum of 16-foot clear. So this again facilitates very tight two-way traffic, but in these areas, we wouldn't expect a lot of two-way traffic. We'd really just expect folks all just getting out, as quick as they can. So a little bit less stringent requirements there. We had met again with Central Marin Fire and with Central Marin Police. We really wanted to make sure that whatever we were proposing made sense to the emergency personnel. And it was during this discussion that we got some really valuable feedback from fire and police saying that whatever our approach is for evacuation improvements, that these tactics should be able to be navigated by residents without fire or police support or intervention. in the event of an evacuation or some sort of wide-scale emergency, there may not be people to respond quickly or be able to staff the area full-time and do stuff like deploy cones or do traffic control. So they made it very clear that we need to come up with an approach that the residents can navigate themselves without being directed by fire or police. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan with parametrics so that he can talk about the general evacuation approach and some of the capacity needs of the neighborhood.
Thanks, Becky. So when we're talking about the general evacuation approach, we're more specifically talking about what are the primary evacuation routes for the neighborhood and what is the capacity and demand for those evacuation routes. And part of that is also identifying those potential bottleneck locations where traffic is going to be most impacted, especially in those scenarios where, as Fire and PD said, there may not be staff available to manage that traffic. And then additionally, what sort of traffic volumes could we anticipate in those evacuation scenarios, and what sorts of conclusions can we draw from that? Moving to the next slide. In this map here, you can see the anticipated neighborhood evacuation routes, with the ridge pathway being the unofficial split in an emergency situation. Now, depending on the location of a fire or an emergency, it may not be the actual split point, but at this level of analysis, it's a good assumption for this level of planning. With that said, Edison is wider and may be a preferred roadway in an egress situation. But because the incident or event will dictate the traffic flow itself, it's important to maximize that egress capacity to better protect the neighborhood in an emergency scenario. So taking a look at where that maximum egress capacity could be potentially limited, it is at these bottleneck locations. And so it's Corte Madera Avenue, because that's the arterial intersection point. It's Edison, because it's where the split with the ridge pathway comes back together at Redwood. And then it's Portola Way, because it's the first place where two streams of traffic may start to intersect with each other as we're moving up Redwood. And so today, Redwood has the right of way with both Portola and Edison because they're stop controlled. And so under current configurations, this does limit the ability for both Portola and Edison to egress in an emergency scenario. So how did we analyze these bottleneck areas? Well, what we did was we took counts at 6 threshold locations in and around these bottleneck areas in the AM and PM peak hours to confirm those traffic patterns. And so what this allows us to do is analyze a worst case existing scenario with regards to traffic delay and queuing, and then compare that to an evacuation scenario. The initial look at that, at those volumes, revealed to us what we anticipated, which is a near 50-50 split with folks going up and down Redwood versus Edison, which again supports that need for maximizing the egress capacity along both routes. And then just to note, today during the peak hours, there's on average 35 seconds of delay for a vehicle waiting to leave Redwood onto Corte Madera Ave or leaving the neighborhood, and an average queue length in the peak of about 120 feet, which is about 6 car lengths. So comparing that existing condition to those evacuation scenarios, what we did was we actually analyzed 2 evacuation scenarios. The first one was to assume in a worst case scenario, 1 vehicle leaving per property from the lower Christmas Tree Hill neighborhood. And then the other scenario was assuming 1.5 vehicles trying to evacuate all at the same time. For the first scenario of 1 vehicle per property from the neighborhood, Edison sees about 3 times the amount of existing traffic flow, and Redwood sees about double the existing traffic flow. And the delay at Corte Madera Avenue specifically gets up to 141 seconds with a queuing length of about 400 feet or 20 cars. In an emergency scenario, the intersection is more likely to operate as a flashing red light, which does help mitigate some of that risk, but that also assumes that everyone's going to be reacting to a traffic signal appropriately, even in a flashing red scenario. But in that flashing red scenario, the egress capacity at Corte Madera Avenue is about 40 seconds of delay and about 120 feet of queuing. In the 1.5 vehicle scenario, Edison has about 4 times the existing traffic flow, and Redwood has about 3 times the existing traffic flow. And that queue length gets up to 600 feet, essentially all the way up Redwood Avenue and beyond. And really excessive delays. And again, in a flashing red light scenario, that is significantly improved. But what that leads us to are two very key conclusions from that analysis, and that's that we need to prioritize up to 2 lanes of egress on Redwood Avenue from Portola Way all the way to Corte Madera Avenue in order to maximize that egress out of the neighborhood. And we also need to prioritize meeting 20-foot fire access standards as much as possible, especially along Redwood Avenue, so that capacity is maintained during an emergency scenario.
Great. Thank you both so much for presenting those existing conditions and the results of the traffic analysis. Before we get into the next segment of the presentation, which is about the conceptual design for undergrounding utilities and roadway improvements, we just wanted to take a quick pause here to see if you all had any questions or clarifying questions about the project goals and the design rationale and the general approach for that was developed by the project team before we actually dive in deeper into some of those conceptual designs. So I do see a question that popped up in chat. Nick, I don't know if you would like me to verbalize that or if we want to, I think some of this might get answered as we go in, but go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, Dave. I think let's keep going since we're gonna be talking and touching on undergrounding in the coming slides. And if this question isn't answered, we'll circle back to Anita and maybe have her come on video if she's comfortable doing that and posing the question live.
Sounds great. Thank you. Yeah, so I'll just maybe wait 10 more seconds here. If you all did want to verbalize a question, as a reminder, you can go ahead and use the hand raise feature at the bottom of your toolbar, and that will let us know that you have a question that you would like addressed now, and or you can drop it in chat. And I do see another question from Richard about the consideration of creating alternative vehicle exit from the hill. I assume, again, some of this we might be addressing here in a second. These are all great questions. It was more so kind of the rationale as to our approach in creating the design alternatives that you are about to see, or the concept design that you're about to see. So I thank you for these questions. We're going to kind of just hold on to these questions and definitely come back to them if you don't feel like they were addressed after this next segment of the presentation. So I'm not seeing any other hand raised, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to you, Becky, to keep us going.
All right, yeah, thank you for that. So the next part of this presentation is an introduction to the conceptual design work that the project team has completed since that first workshop. So this is where we'll get into some of the specifics about our ideas for improvements in the area that hopefully address a couple of the questions that we received so far. So I just want to take a time to just quickly recap some of the key design goals and considerations that we just covered before we start to look at the conceptual design. So in a nutshell, we're looking at maintaining 20-foot clear on roadways. So this is 20 feet available for vehicles to pass each other, so that we have that available during an evacuation event. We're also looking at prioritizing 2 lanes of outgoing traffic on Redwood Avenue, while also maintaining 1 lane of incoming traffic for emergency vehicles or first responders. That way we can get people through the intersection of Redwood and Corte Madera Avenue as quickly as possible, get people off the hill, and to safety as quickly as possible. Of course, due to various constraints on the hillside that you're all aware of, just widening the roadways throughout is not going to be feasible. We've got a lot of onerous terrain that we're working against. So we're trying to meet the spirit of the 20 feet wide where we can, where we can't meet the 20 feet wide, where we can't do physical widening to the roadway. If that pinch point coincides with parking, we have looked at potentially removing some parking to allow for a 20-foot clear for vehicle travel, or this idea that we'll touch on a little bit more here, designating some parking for fire weather restricted parking that could be clear space during a potential likely evacuation event. So with that, let's go ahead and start to talk about some of the improvements. So the first element of our conceptual design involves undergrounding of the overhead utility lines. So we don't believe, based on conversations with PG&E and with Central Marin Fire, that the lines themselves on Lower Christmas Tree Hill are a potential source for ignition for a wildfire. So we don't believe that the lines themselves are going to be generating fire. However, just the presence of a line or a pole during a wind event, let's say, they could block traffic. And since we only really have one way off the hill, we really want to minimize, the potential for a line or a pole to come down and block everybody in on Redwood Avenue. Also, just the presence of some of these overhead poles, it does impact our ability to do the physical widening of the roadway to increase the transportation system capacity. So as such, some of these improvements that we're going to go through, they're predicated on removing the utility poles within that utility undergrounding district that RJ had reviewed on an earlier slide. So that's part of our initial design considerations. And then just a recap for everybody, these red dash lines, this corresponds with that undergrounding district that RJ had a graphic of earlier. This shows the approximate extents of those lines that could be undergrounded. So those poles that would be removed in this scenario, there's 4 of them just on Lower Redwood. These 4 poles circled here, and then the lines that connect between these poles as well as the existing poles to remain, those would all be underground. So that's the extent of the undergrounding that we are entertaining with these conceptual design at this point. All right, so the next element that I want to talk about, this involves the physical improvements to the transportation capacity system. So this is in the form of actual widening of the roadway so that we can get more people down the hill quicker. So before we jump into specific areas, I just want to run through how we're going to approach this because it is a pretty big area that we're going to look at. So we're going to start on Redwood Avenue and we're going to work our way up the hill around Redwood, through the hairpin, over to Morningside, down towards Edison, and then around Crescent. So if there's any questions as we're going through here where we are, let me know, but that's generally how we're going to traverse the Lower Christmas Tree Hill neighborhood. All right, so let's start on Redwood and talk about some of the enhancements that we're looking at. So first, a recap of the existing conditions there. Along Redwood between Edison and Portola, we have on-street parking. We have, 2 very tight travel lanes. We do have ample right-of-way though. We've got planter strips with trees running adjacent to the road on both sides and sidewalks of various widths behind those planters. So we've got a lot of real estate in this area here. Between Edison and Corte Madera Avenue, it's a little bit of a different story. There's little pockets of planter strips, but we see the sidewalk is much closer to the roadway. The roadway as a whole is a little bit more narrow, and our opportunities to potentially widen between Edison and Corte Madera Avenue are limited because there are buildings, there's retaining walls, there's a lot of improvements that make it less feasible to do widening in this block here. So this is a side-by-side. This is a photo of the existing conditions. This is standing near Corte Madera Avenue looking up towards Edison here. And this is a cute cross-section that shows generally what the existing conditions are in this segment. So again, we have the 2 10-foot drive lanes. We have a parking lane that's represented here. We've got sidewalks on either side. These are generally 5 feet, although they definitely vary as you go. You can see we've got the existing power poles. And then we've got space for, trees and vegetation behind the sidewalk over there on that south side. As we go up a little bit, so this is standing generally at Edison, looking up at Portola. Portola's off in the distance here. We have, similar cross section, but it opens up a little bit here. So we have the 2 drive lanes. We have the on-street parking. We've got sidewalks both sides. But in this block, we also see these more generous planter strips. We've got, some saplings and trees in these planter strips on both sides as well. So a little bit wider corridor to work with between Edison and Portola. So what are we proposing here? Well, we're proposing to widen this area as much as we reasonably and feasibly can so that we can, again, address some of that traffic bottleneck that we would expect to happen during an evacuation event. So we've looked at removing the planter strips that are on either side between Edison and Portola and widening the paved surface of the roadway. This is a widening of about 4 to 6 feet on either side. That's about the width of the planter strips. Reconstructing the sidewalk on both sides, so the sidewalk would remain, it'd be replaced, but remain generally in that similar location. And then do a more modest widening where we can here between Edison and Corte Madera Avenue. And then of course, ADA compliant curb ramps, new driveway approaches throughout this area. So again, this allows us to entertain having those 2 lanes of traffic out of Redwood while maintaining 1 lane of traffic in. This is just a quick conceptual striping plan that shows an option that could include putting some sort of striped center median down the roadway. We could, still have outgoing traffic here, incoming traffic here. On-street parking would remain between Edison and Portola. We have enough space to potentially widen so that we maintain that on-street parking, but then have this striped center median area that could be used during an evacuation event. So this is the same photo of the existing conditions I showed you a minute ago, but now we're comparing it to a proposed cross-section. So with our proposed conceptual design, we'd have 2 travel lanes, a little bit more generous than you have now, but comparable width of travel lanes. And then there'd be a center median area, probably just a striped out area that could be used for evacuation. We'd maintain sidewalks as well as some planting, preserve this planting area here. You notice that the pole would need to be gone in this location to facilitate the widening of the roadway. All right, same thing here, standing at Edison, looking up at Portola, existing condition photo here, proposed here. The drive lanes, that center median area between the drive lanes, the on-street parking would remain, sidewalks on either side would remain, and we have some space to spare to maintain this. There's like this planter strip that runs along the base of the retaining walls there on that north side. So let's take a look at what kind of benefits we get from that sort of widening on Lower Redwood. So in a typical traffic flow scenario, so this is your day-to-day, no one's evacuating, this is how we typically operate. People could be, you'd have a dedicated lane out, dedicated lane in, and a striped median or some sort of marked center that would not be used. Vehicles would not travel in this center area here. Again, we'd maintain parking between Edison and Portola. So this parking would be available. It wouldn't be restricted parking. However, due to our inability to physically widen the lowest part of Redwood Avenue, parking in this area could be compromised with this median concept. So let's talk about the benefit that gives us. Ryan touched on the need to get a lot of people through the intersection quick and the magnitude of delay that we'd expect to getting people through this intersection and how we could mitigate that delay or that length of time it takes to get out by having 2 lanes of traffic out. So by doing this widening and reserving this striped center median area, it allows us to have 2 lanes of traffic all the way down Redwood and out through Corte Madera Avenue. Perhaps more importantly though, and to Ryan's point about bottlenecks, everyone coming off of Edison, and that's not just traffic on Edison, it'd be traffic on Morningside, Marina View, Summit. We've got a ton of people who would be evacuating down Edison. Instead of causing a bottleneck where these vehicles are waiting for a gap to turn or potentially getting backed up into the neighborhood, people coming down Edison could use that center lane to turn and to queue up and to evacuate. Similar scenario for anybody on Crescent and Portola. If you're evacuating down Portola, rather than getting caught in a bottleneck, waiting for a gap in traffic to make your left, you can turn into that center median and, store and queue your vehicle here and traverse out through the neighborhood. Everybody coming down Redwood would just take their typical travel lane all the way out through the neighborhood. This also maintains, an inbound lane for emergency vehicles so that we can maintain the ability for first responders to get into the neighborhood. So let's zoom out just a little bit and talk about what happens next. Okay, we can queue up a bunch of cars on Redwood Avenue. We can meet the needs of the neighborhood in terms of queuing. Where do we go next? Well, we think having the 2 lanes of vehicles queued on Redwood is really advantageous for that next step. It enables anybody in that center median to make a left onto Corte Madera Avenue if they choose. It allows anybody in that standard drive lane to go ahead and make a right on the Corte Madera Avenue. But perhaps more importantly, it allows both lanes here, that center median lane and the typical travel lane, to go straight through Corte Madera Avenue and onto Tamalpais Drive and out. So Tamalpais Drive between Corte Madera Avenue and the park, it's only striped for one travel lane through, but there's sufficient width between the striped buffer. There's what am I trying to say? There's a bus stop here. There's a, ample bike lane here. There's enough physical width of roadway between Corte Madera Avenue and where Tamalpais turns into 2 lanes to effectively allow 2-lane traffic to utilize this space out. So it helps us not only get good throughput off the hill, but it helps with a great throughput through the intersection and out towards either the park or the freeway or your ultimate destination. So I've got a handful of renderings here that I wanted to share with the group to show what these improvements might look like. So this first photo, this is standing at Edison looking up at Portola off in the distance here. So you can see the landscape strips, the saplings, the poles on both sides are gone. The roadway is widened into those spaces, but we maintain the sidewalk and parking in this area. This next rendering, this is standing just a little bit past Edison, looking down at Corte Madera Avenue in the distance here. So again, you can see that center median, the travel lanes. You can see that the landscape strip, this is the area that's been removed to facilitate the widening. And one more rendering here. This is standing up at Portola, looking down at Edison here in the background. Same thing, you can see the landscape strips are gone, the parking's maintained. This is sort of the look and feel of that potential striped center median. All right, let's continue. So Redwood, there was a lot going on there, right? We talked about that's really the bottleneck and the pinch point. That's the most critical point of the whole transportation system because that's where everybody is getting through. But let's go ahead and continue to traverse around the hill and talk about other strategic widening improvements that we could do. So as we get up around Crescent and Redwood, this is an area that folks last outreach dialed in on. We looked at opportunities to widen this. This is an extremely difficult area to widen just due to a couple of significant retaining walls here. Impacts to homes, impacts to parking that people have developed off street. So we have not identified any widening improvements for this bottleneck. We've determined that there's actually decent sight lines on either side of Crescent here on Redwood. So this could be an area where we might not meet that 20 feet, it's just shy of 20 feet, but there's opportunities to pull over and allow passing. So no physical improvements here on Crescent. For here on Redwood though, this is over near 450 Redwood. There's another pinch point here that we feel like we can address. So the roadway gets quite narrow. It's about 13 feet wide. So, pretty shy of that 20-foot clear width that we were targeting. You can see the pinch point here between a retaining wall on this side and the TOA slope on this side. So in this area, we'd be looking at widening on both sides of the roads and doing a couple retaining walls probably in the magnitude of, 2, 3, 4 feet tall, sort of splitting the difference between both sides of the road. That gets us in the spirit of that 20 feet wide here, but more importantly, it gives folks an opportunity to pull over, let other vehicles pass before proceeding. So while it doesn't still meet that 20-foot clear, we felt like we didn't want to be too aggressive in this area. Instead, we wanted to make sure that there was a safe, convenient way for 2 vehicles to pass through this space. So again, that existing street view, and then cross section, you can really see the limitations of this software, but essentially there'd be retaining walls. They wouldn't quite look like this from the roadway, but we'd use retaining walls to create a 20-foot wide travel way. All right, as we continue down Redwood, now we're getting over to that hairpin area. There's several pinch points in this area as well that we would look to address. So we're looking to increase the width of the roadway by a magnitude of about 4 to 6 feet in many of these locations. A lot of this would be supported by some small retaining walls to get that more consistent width. Again, we're going for the spirit of 20 feet. Some of these areas we can't quite physically get the 20 feet, but we're trying to make up for that in other areas where you can get good sight lines of anybody coming up so that you can pull over and allow that two-way passing, even if it's not consistently, even if we're not able to consistently get 20 feet throughout. Then while we do work out there, there's also some drainage improvements that we've identified that could be needed at that hairpin. All right, let's make our way up to Morningside. So Morningside was one of those special roads that when we met with Central Marin Fire, we talked about some special considerations for Morningside. We don't believe anybody who doesn't live on this section of Morningside is going to be using Morningside to evacuate. Anybody who's up on Summit or higher is very likely to come down Summit and loop around Edison, which we'll see in a minute here. There'd be no need for them to take the longer, more winding route on Morningside. So Morningside has a different set of width criteria. It's also extremely difficult to do winding out there just due to some of the terrain and topography. So after review of the field conditions out here, we felt like Morningside had 16-foot clear, or in the spirit of 16-foot clear throughout. So no physical winding improvements were proposed for this section. All right, coming around Edison here. Edison, we do expect to get quite a bit more traffic because folks coming down from Summit Drive would very likely use Edison. There's a couple of utility poles that are really constraining the width of Edison in a couple spots, as well as another pinch point over here. So in our conceptual design, we'd look at relocating those utility poles. So we'd move those poles a few feet outside of the roadway so that we can do 2 to 3 feet of widening throughout this, this stretch here on Edison. And that gets us our 20-foot clear so that we can have the two-way traffic safely in this area. All right, coming around the turn on Edison here, the pavement width is actually quite sufficient on this portion of Edison, where we're upwards of 20-foot clear throughout. There's also a series of power poles and some pretty steep slope here on this north side of Edison that would make widening quite difficult. But since we already have that 20-foot clear, we're not identifying any widening improvements in this area at this time. All right, and last but not least, looking at Crescent Road and Portola Way. This is similar to Morningside. The only people who are going to evacuate on Crescent Road or Portola live here. It's a small number of residences. So we have a little bit different criteria for the road width, which is 16 feet. These roads meet or are very close to meeting that 16-foot clear already. So we don't see benefit for any widening improvements in this area. All right, so at the request of the public from our last community outreach and just from our own interest as well, we wanted to see if there were some other ways to get people off the hill in the case of an emergency event. So we explored a couple different alternatives. The first thing that we looked at was this idea of potentially extending California Lane up to Redwood Avenue. So California Lane currently intersects with Corte Madera Avenue, and it stops shy of Redwood. It stops at the base of some hillside steps. So we looked at what it might take to extend it all the way up to Redwood, and we ruled out that as a possibility. The roadway would be exceedingly steep. Even if we rebuilt all of California Lane, it'd be exceedingly steep to get California Lane to connect up to Redwood. There's also not good visibility if you were to make a turn off of Redwood onto California Lane. And then perhaps even worse, there's really not good sight lines at the base of California Lane as you would look to exit onto Corte Madera Avenue. In addition to that, this isn't a town-maintained roadway, so it seemed that California Lane would just not be a feasible option as a secondary ingress or egress point for the hillside. We've also explored this idea of using Middle Summit Fire Road as another evacuation point. So this would require that there be a pilot vehicle to help guide people out of the hillside. This actually seemed like a pretty good option. The road's in decent condition. You can certainly traverse it. However, we believe that there might be concerns around the public's perception of driving up the hill and out into the wilderness to evacuate from a potential wildfire concern. And furthermore, this would require that emergency services, somebody be available to notify people and then direct people and then pilot them out of that roadway, guide them out to safety. So this would be a more involved effort in terms of emergency response staffing. So we've also at this time ruled out the use of Middle Summit Fire Road as a secondary point of evacuation. Okay, the final element of our conceptual design involves more administrative controls and changes to the on-street parking program so that we can increase the effective width of the roadway. So now we're no longer talking about physically changing the character of the roadway, but instead looking at what we can do with parking spaces so that the space that was currently occupied by parking could be made available during an emergency evacuation event for vehicles. So we're going to go area by area, cover each of these colored areas and talk about the existing parking conditions and some potential impacts to parking that we're entertaining with this conceptual design. So again, we're looking for that minimum 20-foot wide on most of these roads. And so where we would have that 20-foot wide by removing parking, we've identified that as parking that could be removed, or we've also developed this idea of this fire weather restricted parking. Which I'll touch on here more in just a minute. So between our strategic widening and between our creative striping with this fire weather parking, restricted parking scenario, of the 150 plus parking spaces on the hillside, we've only identified 7 parking spaces to be removed. So less than 5% of total parking permanently long-term impacted with this concept. All right, let's spend just a minute talking about what this fire weather restricted parking could be. We want some feedback from the public on what this could be. What this idea is, though, is that some parking spaces could be marked with a special pavement marking similar to some of these concepts here. And that would indicate that on certain fire weather days that vehicles could not be parked in that space. Now, how the fire weather restrictions get communicated to people, that could happen in a variety of ways. It could be similar to this red flag warning sign that we have at the base of this is near Edison and Redwood. Maybe a sign like this. It could be a text message or media blast. There could be a variety of ways that we can get the information out to the public to let them know that spaces marked with a marking like this cannot be parked in during fire weather days. Now, these fire weather days are not red flag days. There'd be additional criteria that would be set and need to be met to identify these days. So they would not be as numerous as red flag days. We're thinking maybe a dozen days, 10 to 14 days a year could be these fire weather days. So the vast majority of the time, these fire weather restricted parking spaces could be utilized. How we control the parking, both the restricted parking and the on-street parking. This is another area we'd love some feedback from the public. We've been entertaining the idea of a potential parking permit process. We really want to make sure that there's equity in terms of who gets parking and where you get parking. So again, feedback on how that permitting process could look, but we want to make sure that if you need a space on street that's a non-restricted space, you get that. We also want to make sure that people who are parking in restricted spaces have some way of understanding that they need to move those vehicles, let's say every 24 hours, so that they have an opportunity to, again, understand if that space has been now restricted that next day. So I'm looking forward to some feedback from the public on that when we get to the end of the presentation. But that's the general concept around the fire weather restricted parking that we're going to talk about here. All right, so let's go area by area now. We'll do the same traverse around the hillside. We're going to start over by Redwood and Corte Madera Avenue. Under existing conditions, 14 spaces. This is the only area on the hillside where we're entertaining removing parking at this time. So all 7 spaces that I noted earlier to be removed, they occur over on Redwood right near Corte Madera Avenue. That's great because offset parking on Corte Madera Avenue is readily available. There's on-street parking here. So but these are 7 spaces that we've identified to be removed to support the widening. These white dots here, they represent proposed parking that has no fire weather restrictions. So these would be available year-round, regardless of if there's fire weather conditions or not, because we have ample space to widen and maintain those spaces. All right, going up around Redwood and over to the hairpin, there's 42 existing spaces there. We're not proposing to remove any, but about half of these spaces could be marked as those fire weather restricted spaces. We have a cluster of them here as we approach Crescent Road. Again, these are spaces that if it's a fire weather day and the potential for evacuation is higher, these spaces could not be parked in. That way we have that 20-foot minimum clear to allow for evacuation and concurrent emergency response vehicles. All right, moving along towards Morningside, 13 spaces there. Potentially up to 12 spaces could be identified as those fire weather spaces to make sure that we have clear space for evacuation. All right, coming around Edison. Again, Edison had a good, existing pavement width, but that was counting the parking spaces that are currently along Edison. We don't see a lot of opportunities to widen Edison. So of the 27 parking spaces in this vicinity, about half of them could be marked for that fire weather restricted parking. All those occurring here right along Edison. Right, Lower Edison, this is Redwood Avenue down here for your reference. About 8 on-street parking, maybe a row here that could be restricted so that we can get good throughput during an evacuation event. All right, and then Crescent Road, there's 42 or more parking spaces on Crescent Road. I didn't put 42 dots on here because it's just a lot of white dots, but essentially every parking space on Crescent Road, we intend to maintain as is. So that would be, continued unrestricted parking because we have adequate width around those vehicles, even during an evacuation event. All right, and with that, I'll hand it over to Bree to talk about what happens in the event that you need to use a fire weather restricted parking space.
Yeah, thanks, Becky. So our team identified parking areas within a 1/4-mile radius of the Redwood and Corte Madera Avenue intersection. There's quite a few parking spaces, actually, existing parking spaces at Minky Park that have potential to be utilized. There's more than 30 spaces, and some of those included are accessible parking stalls. There are also many unmarked parking spaces on Corte Madera Avenue, east and west of the Redwood Avenue and Corte Madera Avenue intersection, more than 15 on-street spaces. And there's even some parking north of Minky Park on Redwood Ave as it meets Tamalpais Drive, about 14 spaces. So the idea is that those identified parking spaces that will either be removed on Redwood Ave or become the parking spaces that become fire restricted. These are places that can be kind of offset that parking reduction. And I'll pass it to Dave just to talk through next steps and some public feedback.
Great, thank you. Actually, Becky, I might ask you to speak to this and then I'll take the Q&A.
Yeah, sure, can do. So this is a graphic that's been living with the project for some time, and this shows how we are progressing through the outreach and design of the Lower Christmas Tree Hill evacuation improvement project. So and this just highlights opportunities for public review, public engagement. So I'm going to start with where we are right now. We're approaching summer 2025, which is when we did this community workshop. This is when we planned on it. We got to it maybe a little bit before summer, but this is where we are today. In the future, we expect this project, as we receive feedback from you during this meeting, and as we develop our concept design into a preliminary design, we would take that to BPAC and Town Council to present our design to them and get some additional feedback on bicycle and pedestrian considerations around the project. After we get feedback from BPAC later on this year, probably fall of 2025, we'd plan on having another focus group meeting with town staff, PG&E, fire, police, maybe some other key stakeholders, again, to share what we've learned, to share what we've developed and get some additional feedback from them before we then take the project in fall or winter 2025 back to BPAC and Town Council to essentially present what we think the design should look like as it goes into final design. So that would be all of these are opportunities, the BPAC Town Council meetings, these are public meetings, these are all opportunities to see and hear more about what we're doing and to voice your opinion on where the project is going.
Great, Thank you all for the great presentation, and apologies for my lighting here. This is a weird time of day where the sun comes in sideways. So we now most importantly want to try our best to address the questions that we've heard through chat, and any other ones that you all would like to verbalize at this point. I'm going to go ahead, and just as a reminder, if you would like to verbalize them, go ahead and use that raise hand feature, and I'll unmute you, and a member of the team could then address your question. Or as you all have been doing, you can go ahead and drop any comments or questions you have in chat, and we could address them that way. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the chat questions. Thank you, Becky. And kind of pose that to some members of the team that are on here today. And then again, if you would like to verbalize anything, or if some of your comments weren't addressed that you asked earlier, please feel free to use that raise hand feature. So I'm going to start with a question for RJ that came up, that consider allowing cars parked on the street to face down in the downward position during fire season, as opposed to facing the direction of traffic, so that cars could turn around, and because those cars could actually create backup. So I believe something has to be studied, but RJ, I just want to let you address that real quick.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea. We'll certainly take that in and analyze it, but I don't have a definitive answer for that right now at this time. But thank you for that comment.
Thank you, RJ. Chief Lando, you're a popular one. There's a few questions that came up regarding fire safety. I might ask a couple of them of you now, and then we'll come back to some of the other questions. Penelope had asked that regarding evacuation by foot, what is the plan to move people from Menke Park onto where they can be removed from harm?
Okay, this is an easy question in one sense, but I need to be extremely firm here. Central Marin Fire Departments, it's not just our opinion, it is our educated understanding of wildfires and wildfire evacuation. Under no circumstance should anyone on Christmas Tree Hill evacuate by foot. That's not an option. So the thought that multiple people would be evacuating by foot is consistent with what we've been told by residents that they'd like to do. It is not just inadvisable, it's dangerous, potentially deadly, and a far worse option under every scenario than evacuating by car. So there is no plan to move people from Monkey Park to safety if they've evacuated on foot. That's not a contingency that we're considering. We are saying emphatically you need to evacuate by car. If there is no option, if you do not have a car, if you don't have, the ability to drive a car, what we need neighbors to do on Christmas Tree Hill is work together. You need to fill every seat on every car that leaves that hillside. But I know that's not the answer you're looking for, but this is Central Marin Fires. It's our guidance that we've been giving consistently for the last decade.
Great, thank you for that response. I'm going to pose one more question to you, and then we'll kind of loop back around. But Ethan asked, could the Middle Summit Fire Road be used as an alternative route for residents living above upper Christmas Tree Hill, I believe is what it meant to say, to help reduce traffic lower down on Redwood and Edgewood and provide secondary egress from the hill? Hope that made sense.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. Central Marin Fire Department's considered that. We do believe that that is a potentially viable option. The reasons that were explained earlier, why it may not be the best option, we're accurate. We don't think anybody should turn around and go uphill to take that exit, but there may be scenarios where Central Marin PD or fire resources, if they were available, could provide a pilot vehicle to guide people out with some protection. In the most likely scenarios that we've considered, and we did spend the entire day today working with Central Marin Police and our other fire partners on wildfire scenarios and evacuation planning for Corte Madera and Larkspur. We believe that middle and lower summit fire roads are ideal for allowing fire apparatus access. It's a dangerous route. It's much more dangerous than any of the paved roadways, even with traffic and the potential for backups at the bottom of the hill. Firefighters have additional protection. We have additional training, communications, and additional intel during a wildfire. And we think that those routes are dangerous and are best suited for firefighters to use. And it's an excellent route for us to allow fire engines, rescue personnel to access the hillside without impeding traffic that's attempting to evacuate.
Great. Thank you again, Chief Lando. And why I have you, I'm just going to pose one more comment that more so that came up from Richard. As another location to look at for additional vehicle egress from the hill is Edison to Bar Lane or Lark Court in Larkspur. Similar to California Ave, he believes that the elevation and grade may be a concern, but thinks it should be considered. I'm not sure if you have a response for that, but
I've not looked at any options in that general vicinity closely. I'm not aware of any, obvious engineering, solutions there, although they may exist. I'd certainly say it's worth exploring, other options. But I also want to emphasize again, we've said this over and over again, and I understand why it's difficult, to accept this. But staying in your car on pavement, even caught in traffic, is a perfectly viable option. If we can get as many people to the section of roadway where this engineering work is going to occur, we're in good shape. You as residents are in good shape. The goal is to get into your car, get onto pavement, and get down to the bottom of the hill, where during some wildfire evacuation scenarios, there will absolutely be a traffic jam. We know there will be a backup and there will be some delay in getting out to the main arteries, but we believe, based on all of the evidence from all of the fires we've seen in California in the last 30 years, that this is a safe option for you. And we need to be more focused on filling those seats on the cars than engineering new evacuation routes that don't already exist.
thank you, Chief Lando. Appreciate that. I am going to now jump up for the team to question 5 that came up from Anita, I believe, as a request from Linda. And this is a question for Greg at PG&E. It's a long one, so bear with me. But at previous meetings, it was said that PUC and PG&E did not consider Christmas Tree Hill a high-risk area, despite it being a WUI, or I believe it's the Wildland Urban Interface adjacent, and often parts of Redwood and Summit are essentially one-lane roads. PG&E and PUC and Corte Madera representatives said letters from Christmas Tree Hill residents expressing concern would be helpful when the next review to prioritize undergrounding occurs. So please provide contact information so that these concerns could be sent to PG&E and PUC. Greg, I don't know if you wanted to just address that. I know that came up at the previous workshop. Oh, Greg, I don't think we could hear you. You're unmuted, but for some reason. I think we've lost it here temporarily. Craig, I'll let you think on that. We'll come right back to you, and I'll maybe pose a question to you, RJ, a couple questions, and then we'll come back to you, Greg. Down to question 9. Ethan had asked, are there any plans for making improvements to Upper Christmas Tree Hill in the future, specifically about parking and undergrounding of power lines?
Yeah, good question. Christmas Tree Hill as a whole is still a priority for the town with respect to evacuation and wildfire mitigation and all those things. So certainly it's on our radar of a future project. But nothing has yet been kind of set in terms of timeline or funding for that future project. We're really kind of focusing on this effort and obviously hopefully get to see how things actually behave and improve as this project gets built. And yeah, I mean, it's likely that this will be a kind of a script that we apply multiple places in Corte Madera, including Upper Christmas Tree Hill over the years. But no specific timeline or funding identified at this moment.
Thank you, RJ. Greg, I might come back to you real quick. I see you back on camera. Should we try again? Yeah, we still don't hear you. I'm not sure. Is it just me, team? I don't think you were on earlier.
I don't hear. Maybe try to connect by phone and we can come back.
Good idea. Yeah, let's try that, Greg. RJ, while we're on the topic, where there's a couple questions related to parking. Richard noted that there are homes on the hill without driveways or garages of any kind. Street parking is essential for those homes, and he's asking if he doesn't know if there's ways where cars would park during emergencies, or doesn't know where those cars would park during emergencies. And if there's a way to make space. Wait, I'm sorry, I'm losing my place here. I don't know where these cars would park during emergencies if you are able to make space not usable during restricted parking periods. I don't think I totally understood. You get that question?
Well, I'll respond, and if there needs to be a follow-up, we can.
Yeah.
And I someone can flash the exact numbers, but it sounds like somewhere around half of the spots available in the public right of way would remain consistently, on all days of the year, and it's the other ones that would be restricted. And the numbers, yeah, we've heard is roughly 14 or so a year. It's really looking at those locally significant red flag days for this area in particular, and that would be determined by Central and Fire. But yeah, we do want feedback on should those special red fire weather day spots be as part of a parking program that's limited to residents, and should it be done by an application? Should it be done by a lottery? Should it be done by who's most impacted or who has the least amount of parking? This is obviously where it becomes challenging. We want to do the most fair and reasonable process, but that's easier said than done. So definitely one of the areas of this workshop we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, RJ. Just one last thing Richard wanted to note is it'd be difficult for homeowners to load their cars for evacuation if their cars were parked far away.
Yeah, and some of the analysis that we're still doing but have started is, we saw it from some of the poll, some people do have one or more private parking spot already off. And I think, in an ideal world, everyone would at least have one parking spot. And so, yeah, in those 14 days, you might have to pick your son, daughter, wife, or husband up at the parking lot down at the hill, or maybe you got to invest in a electric scooter that sits in the back of your trunk and helps you get home. Obviously we got to be creative. This is a challenging location, and we're just trying to apply, really trying to apply and balance the safety benefits with trying to minimize convenience as much as possible.
Thank you, RJ. Greg, I was going to try to loop back around. Any luck?
I don't know. You tell me, Dave. Can you hear me?
Yes, success.
Okay.
Back to you.
My apologies. We've always had this trouble. Team Zoom. All right. So back to the question. What is PG&E doing? PG&E is currently executing our 2023 to 2026 undergrounding plan. That was approved by the California Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety and the CPUC. Currently, PG&E right now is working on our 10-year undergrounding plan. We do plan on submitting that this year. That new plan will go beyond the 1,230 miles that we're currently approved for through 2026. And the good news is that Christmas Tree Hill is part of our new risk modeling, I guess, our analysis that we're going to submit to this California Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety. Once the CPUC and the California Office of Energy Infrastructure approve it, PG&E will be giving guidance on how to move forward. As far as Christmas Tree Hill goes, beyond 2027, there is talk about either trying to get undergrounding or system hardening work approved. And that's not up to us, that's up to the CPUC. And so what we're hoping is that we can, in its entirety, and or sections of Christmas Tree Hill, do system hardening and or undergrounding work. That's kind of where we're at right now. I don't have any more information because, again, we're submitting the plan and hope to get approved by 2027. Dave, can I answer any other questions?
Greg, this is RJ Sico. Could you just spend a moment talking about system hardening and how that's also an effective tool?
Sure. So system hardening, what we do is we take our existing pole line that goes probably from Tamalpais and Redwood up, and we will reconductor, that means put wire in place that is has a sheath on it. It's a protective tree wire, we call it. So any branches or anything that touches that wire will not cause fire compared to the current configuration that we have existing on the Christmas Tree Hill. That's going to require, luminescent wrapped poles. Those are fire retardant pole wraps. They're more girthier poles. The wire is heavier, stronger, and it is, slated to, again, not have contact with branches. When it drops to the ground, it's not going to cause a fire because it has a sheath over it. Obviously, there will be some negatives. If a tree does come down on that wire and that pole line, it will impact the egress and degress of that area. But again, the fire resistant poles, the fire resistant conductor that we are installing will make it a lot safer for the Christmas Tree Hill area.
Great. Thank you, Greg. And I think you might have answered this partially this meeting, and I'm sure you did the last, but just wanted to, Craig had asked if the poles are undergrounded, what happens to the cables that remain for things like internet and cable. So I'll let you respond to that.
Sure. So what we have is, it's called a joint pole agreement, and that is with our telecommunications partner. I don't know if that's AT&T or Verizon that handles most of the Corte Madera area up at Christmas Tree Hill. But if PG&E decides to underground our utilities, AT&T or Verizon is not required to do so. We strongly encourage them, as we, as the city of Corte Madera will strongly encourage them to please use the same trench as us. However, again, we are two separate entities. We share a pole. So PG&E has the right, has the go ahead to underground our lines, and our telecommunications partners do not, not comply, but, work with us in underground their lines. What you'll have is basically where the telecommunications lines, the big thick conductors on our lines that are usually 10, 15 feet below our wires, they will be left in place. We will top those poles, and the infrastructure that is housing that telecommunications gear will remain in place.
Thank you, Greg. Let's see. I believe I see one other question. Maybe it has something to do with parking and or emergency response, but RJ, I might pose this to you. With the idea that we should be in our cars to evacuate, we need to park close to our homes. Restricting parking could create evacuation by foot simply because we must go down to get our car. I think this is similar to a previous thought. So yeah, I think maybe we already kind of responded to that now that I'm
Okay,
reading
yeah,
it,
I
but
mean,
this is a separate question. Yeah,
more analysis to do, but
yeah.
the hope is that, you know, with if you look at private public space or private parking spaces and public parking spaces, that there's enough for everyone to fit in a car and get down the hill. You know, I think in the prior workshop, Central Run Fire was saying, hey, you know, pack your family into one car, and if you can, put your neighbors in there too. You know, don't bring every car in your household. So, you know, obviously, you know, we'd have that's something worth talking about if we were to, you know, if we were to create a new parking program. You know, have a first priority to people that don't have any public, private, or sorry, any private parking spaces. You know, so is that how we should approach it, or is that, you know, not, you know, is that not the best solution? So those are the types of things we'd love to hear.
Great, thank you, RJ. Okay, I'm going to ask the team. I believe there were some other chat comments that came in that were responded to directly through chat. There's a few items that we'll have to follow up on as we put together the summary for this. And as RJ mentioned, there are some of these comments and suggestions that will continue to be part of the ongoing analysis. But I'm going to ask the project team here if there's anything I've missed. We're tracking all this on a concurrent sheet just to make sure we respond to everything effectively. Nick, is there anything that you wanted me to respond to?
No, there are a lot of great questions and comments, and I think we answered everything pretty thoroughly. If the public feels otherwise, please raise your hand or drop something in the chat again. But I believe we responded to all the
I'll
items.
also just add, you know, please send us an email, send a note through the webpage. You know, we should, you know, and you got some time. You know, if you get us something within the next 2 weeks, then absolutely not a problem. We'll include it in the record for our workshop summary.
There was a question that just came in the chat from Penelope. What happens if the roads become blocked by poles or trees down and people can't evacuate by car?
So the reason we, you know, started the undergrounding district at the bottom was so that we could rule out a electrical pole down that would block everyone from getting off the hill. Now, could that happen on another street? I guess presumably it could, but even though it would be a longer traverse, there would be now another way to go around. Secondly, with trees and whatnot, it's common for whether it's fire or maintenance folks to, you know, cut it up with a chainsaw, and then, you know, you do what you got to do. You push it with your car and get out of the way. So again, significantly reducing our risk overall by having a redundant egress point. But yeah, you know, in a freak scenario, you might have to wait for that first responder or maintenance crew to help clear the way.
I would suggest to everyone that they listen to or and watch the Fire Safe Marin video, Make It Downhill Alive. All of these questions are addressed in detail, far more detail than we can address now, but there are answers and solutions to that. And if I lived on Christmas Tree Hill, I would watch that video regularly and memorize it. It's important to you.
Appreciate that, RJ and Todd, and that's a great reminder that we'll go ahead and add that a link to that maybe into the summary as well, or definitely can add that into the summary as a resource, as well as add it to the project website. Great. So RJ did mention that there's opportunities to send email and or comments. I'm going to ask Becky if you wouldn't mind bringing up that final slide. We do have a project website dedicated to this process, and it includes the video, and as Becky mentioned, the video and summary from the previous workshop. It'll also include a summary of this workshop and this video that you're watching now will be posted there as well as a resource. There's also an opportunity to sign up for ongoing email lists. As RJ mentioned, the email on the screen, pwcounter@cordemadera.gov. You can go ahead and email that any other questions or comments that you might have that might come up over the next couple of weeks or really anywhere beyond. But if it comes up in the next couple of weeks, we'll include it as part of this kind of workshop summary. And there's a QR code on the screen as well that'll take you there directly. And I believe magically we have completed this workshop right on time. So unless there's any other comments or questions for the team, I think we'll go ahead and close it up. Nick, I'll turn it over to you if you had any other final thoughts.
Yeah, no other final thoughts. Just please continue to stay engaged with us. We want to take your input and your feedback and move forward with that input as we continue to finish the preliminary design, and then we roll into the engineering design once we have some alternatives that we look at a little closer. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and I would encourage you to, for any of your neighbors that weren't able to join us and maybe don't know about this, please share the material. It's our goal to really reach everyone. It just makes for a smoother and more thoughtful process.
Excellent. With that, we're going to go ahead and close the meeting and send you all on your way. Thank you so much for spending the evening with us, and we hope to see you at a future event. Have a great night, everyone. Take care.
Thanks all.